Hi. So today, or this afternoon, evening, I have someone really interesting here to talk to on the shapes and segments of the ocean industry, because that's the part of the project that we're in. And I'll let Matt introduce himself a little bit and what he does in the ocean industries.
Thanks, Jacqueline. Very nice to be invited. And congratulations with your podcast and this work you're doing. It's very interesting. My name's Matt Duke. I am from a very small village outside of Cambridge in the United Kingdom, but have lived in Norway the last 20 years. And I am CEO in Grieg Maritime Group. Being an Englishman that speaks Norwegian and living in Norway means that sometimes I get words mixed up between Norwegian and English, so I'll give that as a disclaimer. Grieg Maritime Group is a shipping company. My background is somewhat unusual, I suppose, for shipping, at least to be a CEO in shipping, I guess. I'm an environmental scientist by education. I studied various parts and aspects of the social environment and the physical environment, specializing around sustainable development. Not a huge demand for that in the 90s. So then I embarked on a digital career where I worked in various companies in the UK, and then was so lucky to be asked to join a company called Odfjell SE, a chemical tanker company, fantastic company. Had 15 years with them, the last 5 or 6 years as their IT director. And then, Jacqueline, I went over to Kongsberg and worked with you for a while. I was working in Kongsberg Digital with a maritime focus and commercial focus there. And then joined Grieg and became their CEO in 2019. That's basically my background, abridged.
Yeah, you always have to abridge it, otherwise it would take your lifetime up to now to explain. So, which kind of segments of the industry do you see yourself operating in?
Do I see myself operating in, or do we operate in?
But a little bit of both, because the way that you say that you operate in it is not necessarily what you actually operate in. Because there's a lot of adjacent overlap between things.
Well, I think first of all, Grieg is a quite well-known brand in Norway, I think, and that's actually quite a big family-owned group of companies. First of all, everything in Grieg, 25% is owned by a foundation, a charitable foundation, which is called the Grieg Foundation. Fantastic work they do. And then when we look at the different companies in Grieg, you have the big ones that people often talk about are Grieg Seafood, which is on the stock market. And then you have the shipping side, Grieg Maritime Group, where I'm CEO. We also have a whole bunch of other extremely exciting companies like Grieg Logistics, Grieg Investor, Grieg Capital. But we'll talk about Grieg Maritime Group. But for those that are interested, we just launched a brand new webpage from the mothership, grieg.no, so they can have a look at our business segments. Grieg Maritime Group, well, there are various parts of our business. When it comes to the core of our business is ship owning and ship management, and we have a joint venture called G2 Ocean for the commercial side of our business. G2 Ocean is one of the world's largest open hatch shipping actors, with a focus on wood pulp, other commodities, project cargoes, and we're headquartered from Bergen in Norway. So for Grieg Maritime, that investment's very important for us. So those vessels and building vessels and maintaining them and providing the best tonnage we can towards our joint venture is critical. But we also have a few other business areas around that. And, it's been a fantastic period in open hatch shipping. Really good times after a long period of difficult markets. But alongside our core, we believe that you should always have kind of I would call it like a burning platform approach. So what can we do that can make the world somewhat better and also be profitable? So we have another company called Grieg Edge, where we try to invest in companies and opportunities that have sustainability as a core principle, and moving towards zero emissions as a core principle. Those segments are short sea shipping in Norway. We're looking at energy infrastructure projects related to hydro and making new fuels with electrolysis. We also do direct investments in companies in something called our Ocean Ventures team. And generally look for where we can take this position that perhaps will be a bit too risky on the open hatch and the core, but can contribute to a better understanding of how to decarbonize. And also, for example, with short sea, where you have a segment that has very old vessels, can we take a position there that's profitable and green? And the final business segment I'll talk about now is Grieg Green, led by PMO. That is a recycling kind of oversight project company where we try our best to help ship owners with sustainable ship recycling towards the latest regulations and so on, which is a really interesting company as well.
That's really interesting. I'm still trying to get Pia to do this, but we haven't found a time.
Yeah, Pia is of course very busy as she's a commercial and has a company to run.
Yeah.
I highly recommend you have a chat with her. I also highly recommend you try to get Nikolai Grieg, who runs Grieg Edge, on for a chat, and Otle Sommer, who runs Grieg Star. It could also be interesting to have a chat with.
That would be great if you can send me the contacts at some point.
Sure.
So you're working in many different segments of the ocean industry, I would say. Where do you find the most need for transformation to kind of meet the goals that Europe has put and the goals that Norway has put, and also to have, in general, good, safe, healthy operations?
So I think we could look at where's the greatest need, or we might say where is it most viable. So if we look at the world's CO2 emissions and the 3% related to shipping, that is predominantly deep sea. That's where most of the emissions are. But that is not only referred to as a hard to abate segment for CO2 reduction, but it really is a hard to abate segment. So I think then the question becomes, well, where is it viable to make big changes? So when it comes to deep sea shipping, incremental decarbonisation is just good business sense. So whatever vessel energy savings devices you can get onto a vessel is just, going to reduce the carbon, reduce your fuel footprint, and that's fine. We chose to accept the offer from the Green Shipping Program to do a kind of a pilot study, a tabletop study. Well, if you were going to retrofit one of those Ultramax size bulkers, what would it take to run on green ammonia, for example? And that wasn't just a technology question. That was an everything question. The finances involved, the infrastructure, the safety, and so on. Long story short, it is feasible, but as long as carbon doesn't cost more, and as long as the infrastructure isn't there, it just doesn't make sense. I would say, though, Jacqueline, this viability question is also about the burning desire in Grieg to make a difference and to be part of the solution and not be passive. So we can happily work with our partners to show the challenges, but we don't do it to stop the transformation. We do it to encourage the changes that are needed to accelerate the transformation. Where things are more viable is in piloting in the short sea space.
Definitely.
Yeah, so we think that's very interesting. And both.
But when you're talking about short routes and you're talking about inland waterways and you're talking about, then you can play the electricity game, which you cannot play deep sea. It's just not possible to get batteries that big.
No, I think, well, there is something around energy density and batteries, and I'm not going to pretend that I'm an expert. So one of the things I've learned from 20 years of following digital technology very closely is it's a bit dangerous when we say it's not possible, it's impossible.
Right. Today, you can't build a vessel and outfit it with enough batteries to make it across the Atlantic or the Pacific with a full load of cargo, or
exactly.
Even a half load of cargo.
A peer from shipping in Norway, who I really like, and hello if he's listening to this, I really like a chap called Lasse Stoppersen, who was the boss of Klaveness, now is running Williamson.
You said Wilhelmsen, yeah.
And I think it was him that said, if we were going to use batteries on one of our deep sea voyages, we'd need a ship the same size.
Yeah.
Batteries.
Yeah, it's a little bit better when you look at hydrogen, and then it's a little bit better when you look at ammonia, but you can't source it. You can't get enough of it.
And then and then you have to start asking yourself about the natural resources needed and so on. But it is a bit dangerous, these black and white answers. So there's a reason why I triggered that little conversation. Yeah. But actually, Grieg was, as far as I know, the very first shipping company to install a hybrid battery solution on one of our open hatch bulk ships. And what we did was we experimented with the fact that we use a lot of energy at shore with cargo operations. So we made a solution with what has become Corvus, and I believe Kongsberg was involved, and the crane, supply, and all the rest of it. But basically, we made a solution so that when you put the cargo down, you regenerate electricity, and then you use the battery and lift it up. Lots of lessons identified with that project, but it shows that what I'm afraid of is that as an industry, we are being pushed into this political debate where there are some unfortunate P's. I don't know if you've heard of them, Jacqueline, but these 3 P's of popularism, post-truth, and polarization. And my humble view is we need to do lots of small things in order to be able to do the big things down the line. And it needs to be science-based. So the fact that we can now refer to a report that shows you that the capex of it retrofitting the green ammonia on an open hatch ship is just nonsensical, and should be seen as a win, right? It should be seen, okay, so we've heard that it's a little bit sort of impossible, but now the policymakers can have a look at the document that shows technical details of what it would take.
Yeah, I'm not really a fan of the politicization of hydrogen and ammonia, because I think that the general public doesn't know how incredibly dangerous those kind of concentrations of those substances can be. If we have that many tons of ammonia or that many tons of hydrogen being bunkered onto a vessel, and they have bunker spills all the time now. I mean, with LNG, it's slightly safer, but it's also, mainly transferred by more specialized crews than you would have generally in the maritime market. So you're either talking about a major upskilling all over the maritime market, along with building infrastructure that doesn't exist, along with making production facilities for these fuels that doesn't exist, and then transporting large amounts of it in populous areas. So it concerns me a lot.
Yeah, all right. So, and then you have there are 2. I understand your concerns. I think I believe there were quite a few of those concerns were part of this report, where we had, amongst others, Norwegian Maritime Authority as a partner. But you know what? If you work systematically and you start on the small scale, that is what leads you to being able to make big changes on the big scale. There are many aspects of this that need to be further discussed politically around, for example, where should we focus the use of renewable energy? What do we think is an acceptable loss in energy from production to, from producing a fuel to it being burned on a vessel, for example? They're important debates to have and are being had. But at the same time, as a nation, as a seafaring nation, we should make sure that we're testing every possible outcome, every possible technology, so that we have an edge, right? And that's where I mean with this in criticality of being able to happily make as an efficient as possible diesel oil deep sea ship, because that's what we have available today, perhaps with some hybridification, perhaps with the possibility to use shore power or use a fuel cell to move out.
Well, there's also the possibility of biofuels that people don't talk about quite enough, because there is the possibility to ramp up production of that quite quickly comparatively to other possible fuel sources. But then you're not talking about, zero. Really, you're talking about non-plus gain almost.
That's also a great subject. So let's dance around that. And I think with everything we've actually discussed in the last 15 minutes, it should be emphasized that many of us are in this, and we're doing our very best to understand the problem statement.
Of course, yeah.
Without good solutions. But no one I've met at least says they definitely know what the answer is. So let's just be open about that.
Yeah.
So as a CEO, it's about purpose. You do want to make a difference for the environment. You do want to have a opportunity to do good whilst also being profitable. But it's also about risk mitigation, right? So you have to try different things. So biofuel you raised was interesting. We've tested biofuel, so just to make sure we know it works. But then we see that this carbon capture technology is becoming feasible. And as part of a presentation I heard from one of the suppliers, Foxilla, their solution. And where I think potentially for deep sea we need to have a new discussion is this zero emissions versus greatly reduced emissions.
Yeah.
And that's just a practicality. So if you start thinking in terms of circularity, you could imagine that you use carbon capture on a vessel. So for every ton of fuel burned, you get 3 tons of CO2, whatever. And that carbon that's captured is then combined with sustainably produced hydrogen to make a synthetic fuel. So if we only say it's going to be 100%, well, I don't think you're going to get 100% carbon capture on a vessel for a while, but wouldn't 70% with all the other vessel energy savings devices and the circularity of the carbon be very interesting? So I believe there will be potentially many different types of new fuels and carbon capture and vessel energy devices out there, and battery hybridification and so on, peak shavings, whatever. But it's very hard to predict. And what is interesting is that people are now making bets on methanol or green ammonia, but most of those bets are based on also being able to burn heavy fuel.
Yeah, but I mean, even if you have an LNG fueled engine, or you have, as long as you're talking about the internal combustion, if you're using ammonia as well, you have to have pilot fuel, and the pilot fuel right now is MDO.
Yeah, about 10% or something.
Yeah. So you're not getting away from it, and you could potentially use biofuels, but then we also talk about the production volume of what that would take, because right now it's very expensive to source and enough for a deep ocean voyage, and some players are willing to pay a premium for that. For their cargo owners are willing to pay premium to have the stamp to say to their consumers that their third scope emissions are lower or zero. But it's really difficult to source that much if we were going to say switch most ocean-going vessels to biofuel today, which would be possible to burn on most engines.
And then where does the biofuel come from as well?
Exactly.
So
That's
are
what
you going
it.
to take away land for food to produce?
Well, I always thought it was really interesting if they did it with algae and seaweed, because they can put algae farms floating around where they're putting wind farms and do extra production that way, where they're not then tilling soil. Because, of course, as soon as you start tilling more soil, you're releasing what the soil had. And we got into that actually in my talk with Matt, the other Matt. 2 days ago from Acro or Biomarine.
But again, and the reason I mentioned this, does it have to be absolute zero on carbon, is because what I believe passionately, not just because I studied it many years ago, but because now is, I think, a fairly well proven scientific fact that the world is warming and that humans have had an effect on that warming. So the world has come together, and there is the Paris Agreement, and we want desperately to reduce the amount of warming, preferably to 1.5 degrees. I think this looks a bit sketchy that we're going to make that, right? So my view here is just holistically, we really need to step up for the next generations. We need to find ways to decarbonize. That's one thing. I think that the world needs more energy. So most likely that path to decarbonisation.
Well, there's a really interesting graph, and I think it was by The Economist, but I'm not sure, that was showing that we're actually not changing the fuel mix at all. We're just adding energy on top, because we're not able to even keep up with the growing demand for electricity and for energy with the sources that we have. We're always adding. And when we're adding, right now we're adding some green stuff, but we're not taking away anything else, which is, really interesting statement on the problem, because we're not ramping up fast enough in the infrastructure space to be able to deal with not only current growing demand, but also
future
taking old things offline.
So I would assume, and I might be wrong again in the speculation, but I would assume the right thing to do is to dramatically scale up the extraction of gas, natural gas, and in parallel double, triple, quadruple down on the continued development of renewables. So I don't, in order to get the volume of renewable energy without crippling the economy. And remember, there is a direct correlation between availability of cheap energy and reducing poverty.
Yeah, exactly.
So my view is we need more oil and gas, or at least gas, and with that will give us hopefully enough of a curve that as the renewables come up, they will take more space. I think you'll find that nuclear power is a very important part of that.
Well, that's when it really comes into the conversation, because most places are not building new nuclear plants, and haven't, like if you look at the US, for many years, and instead they build new coal plants because nuclear is seen as dangerous, yet coal is seen as safe, which is very confusing.
And that's where, as an industry, it becomes feasible to push the carbon challenge away and say, look, if as a planet we're building out more coal power stations, even as close as home as I believe Germany have had to get to preserve coal power, how can it be morally correct to start using this precious energy to produce green fuels for the maritime sector, or
exactly, for any sector,
and that is a legitimate position, isn't it?
And that's one of the positions with the electric cars in some areas. They're like, our electricity is coming from coal, it's less emissions for me to drive my regular conventionally fueled car, whether it's diesel or gas, than to pay the transmission losses for electricity made from coal.
Right. But then it's also legitimate to say that the government and policymakers need to look at things holistically and globally. and the maritime industry is tasked with a pathway to zero emissions.
Yes.
So that means that we have to be careful to not slow down the transformation, but it means that it might not be possible to do everything with green fuels in the next few years, right? There might have to be other technologies and efficiency measures. And that's why I think for us in Grieg, being very active in the short sea segment in projects, looking at how can we produce more of this renewable energy and also and new fuels, and how can we test it out a little bit on the short scale, is a very valid thing to do. But it's not the same thing as us saying that we will have green fuels on all of our deep sea vessels tomorrow, because it's just not feasible. So I think that's this kind of balance, and it's quite tricky from a communication perspective because you end up with polarization again.
Yeah.
So we need to keep working towards reducing emissions.
Yeah, I think the short sea is also a really interesting segment, because although vessels are not as green as we wish they were, it's still the best besides pipelines you can possibly have. And I think that that's, something that's not talked about nearly enough, is moving cargo from roads and trucks, especially in the inland waterway sector, to the waterways, because you're having less need to overcome friction and you can transport much more effectively per ton of cargo moved, which is not a conversation that's widely had, but should be had, because instead of putting it on electric trucks, you're also using less energy. And especially if their trucks are getting their electricity from coal, and you're a little bit lost.
Road to sea has been an ambition to sort of a mandate to push for very, very many years in the Norwegian shipping sector. But it is very tricky because it's, again, political. But I think the facts are there that per ton mile, shipping is very, very effective. Right? Compare it to road or, God forbid, air freight. So or train. So shipping is good and wants to be better. And the fact that I say that it's very difficult to abate deep sea shipping doesn't mean that I don't passionately want to be part of the solution.
Yeah.
It means that I'm a realist, and that through EDGE we can really push boundaries and ruffle feathers and try to see what is possible or not. But ultimately, science is a critical aspect. So this post-truth, we need to not fall into this trap.
Well, it's not even necessarily the science that's the limiting factor there. There's not enough infrastructure and production, because if you have an ammonia vessel and you want to go from here to there, you can't get bunkers there. So it's really challenging.
But normally, the way the world works is that the infrastructure and the services come when the market encourages them to.
Yeah.
And what I thought was fascinating with the Grieg Star and Grieg and Green Shipping Program project that's just been released, you should have a look at that, it's on the webpage, was that if the carbon tax had gone up to $150, $200 a ton, then it was actually economically viable. So as long as carbon is cheap, as long as you are incentivized to use fossil fuels, then there will be no hope that the infrastructure will come, because the market won't support the production. Right? I also think when it comes to renewable energy, we need to kind of not just think about what's possible today, but in the future, if they keep scaling up all of this renewable energy, a challenge with renewable energy is that it's not the same output as a oil or a coal or a nuclear power plant. It's dependent on the waves, the wind, the solar. So being able to produce green ammonia or hydrogen with the otherwise wasted electricity, because you have no storage, is one aspect. Another might be, as I believe it was in Tesla's latest market day, they said, well, they want to make these giga battery farms, right? So, but either way, when we talk in absolutes, right? Yeah, imagine 70% loss in energy. Well, that's the absolute where you think that every little watt of energy produced is being used, and maybe it's not. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
On a small scale, that has a role in this transformation.
No, it's really a difficult problem. And I mean, even when you're talking about road to sea, even if you have electric vessels there, it's still really difficult to have even the ports to handle those kind of vessels, let alone the infrastructure to charge them. And like you said, it requires kind of cooperative development, because it's not just enough that the market's there. It's that they know that the market will be there and you're going to be operating on those routes. And then it's a partnership in development. It's not necessarily one player and independent players market forces. It's cooperative development, it's cluster development, because that's in a way the only way you get the start of infrastructure, because in the end the market will make the other 50 stations, but you have to have the first 3 as kind of a use case for the demand.
So that's good. And that, I mean, this, I don't, for those listening, you probably not learned anything, right? Because we're just repeating what everyone else is thinking. But then let's also repeat another thing, which is, as a project portfolio manager or as an engineer, there is this classic thing where you're looking at a whole bunch of opportunities to solve. What has the highest impact and what has the least complexity? And luckily, in shipping, there is a ocean of opportunities to do what we do today smarter, just-in-time arrivals, routing efficiency, using AI to be even better at predicting where your route should be, all the vessel energy savings devices you can imagine, incentivizing everybody that even if you're changing a light to LED bulb to use a little bit less energy, it's all good and in the purpose of reducing carbon. So for us, I think that's the thing. When it comes to the future, we're going to need to have some kind of optionality so that when new infrastructure comes online, perhaps a vessel can take advantage of that without too much major retrofitting costs. One of the advantages of doing that pilot now is to kind of understand, well, if you did have to retrofit, what could you do to make it easier? So that's one thing. And the other thing is just to keep incentivizing and celebrating all these small, be best operational improvements.
Definitely. I think, the efficiency is a big win all of the time, because you're also reducing costs. For every little bit of energy you don't use, you don't have to pay for. So not only are you not possibly paying a penalty in a carbon tax, you're also not paying to buy extra fuel in the first place. And there's a lot that can be done that isn't done. Same like tuning of steering systems, automatic tuning, that's not being done. And there's a lot of gains to be had there. You can gain almost 8%. And
I remember someone showed me that all the small, tiny course adjustments, effect, actually together was a huge.
It's about 8%.
So that's the 8% you're referring to. Yeah. There you go. But these things here are also very important because I mentioned purpose. So when encouraging this fantastic industry to all of the young women, and there is space for some men as well that would like to come into shipping, those tangible, exciting projects and changes and improvements are there for the taking. So we would love to have new insights. And people talk about digitalization, which is a bit close to it. And you have two sort of trains of thought, and that is, without even asking anyone, you make a huge 3D model and you've got all sensor data, and it is a pretty impressive feat. Brilliant. But no one knows how to use it or to get any value from it, right? So that's one end of the scale. The other end of the scale is the ones I like to celebrate is, well, what can you do in your purchasing department? How can you empower those brilliant people that are making sure that every invoice is as good as it can be, every contract is done as well as it can be, that we have a logistics that gets spare parts where they should be in the right time frame.
Well, then there's also something to be said for the digitalization of the logistics chain overall between all of the intermodal players and making that system work well, which is one of the things that SAMS does as a cluster. They are looking at the system level of efficiency for autonomous vessels and sustainability.
So this is important stuff because now I have two hats on, right? We need actors like Grieg that are going to push the boundaries and do small scale pilots just to help the industry learn. But we need to celebrate the core of our business, G2 Ocean, Grieg Star, Grieg Shipholding, where we will fight for every small efficiency measure we can, and we will design the most efficient fuel effective vessels we can. And we need to celebrate that that's the right thing to do as well, and not get kind of into a paralysis because we don't know what the new fuels are going to be.
Yeah, that's so true. There's so much that can be done. And I think that there's, if you picture what the future for maritime is in 10, 15, 20 years, we hope, one, we're not having necessarily this fuel conversation. I think there'll be many different fuels. But I think also that we're going to have very smooth operations. Everything is tied together. Everything is scheduled together. Everything is, one process finishes, the other process starts.
Right. So then there is another, I agree. But then there is a very important layer, that invisible layer, as I think you've called it, that has to work, and that's the regulations. Yeah. So one of the other outcomes
can bring up my small picture.
There you are, invisible forces. So one of the other outcomes of our tabletop exercise with partners to look at retrofitting and green ammonia and so on, that was the realization that for us in our segment, the CII doesn't work. So actually, we would be incentivized to go ballast.
Ballast, yeah. It's crazy.
But yeah, yes and no. So something as complex as CII, we need to be generous with the IMO that maybe there could be opportunities to fine-tune this. Maybe there will be shortfalls, and the whole thing is designed to not really be enforceable before a few years' time, right?
Yeah.
But what I thought was great with this is that, as I understand, there's been some good conversations already after that presentation where the people that are responsible for that are like, oh shit, no, now that you've showed us facts, now you've done the maths, now you have not had any hidden agenda, but you've worked with banks and you've worked with the NMA and everyone to just try and reduce this carbon and showing what the chances we have, that they're looking to improve those rules, right? So this is what I mean about being proactive. That's an important thing to do. Many other.
I think that there's also something to be said with collaboration here, because I feel that if the IMO had collaborated with industry more in trying to shape those regulations together to make meaningful change, and said, not that we're going to regulate you and you do as we say, but we want to create a better world together. How might we do that? Which is, one thing about this project is the question really is, how might we? And not necessarily that I know anything or that you know anything or that anyone has the answer alone, but that if we get enough voices and enough people thinking about it, that eventually we can have a collaboration towards what the future could be together.
I mean, I do not know the background for how these rules have been. Well, I do kind of know the process, but I genuinely believe, from the bottom of my heart, believe from the people I've met in the IMO and the discussions I've had, these people want to make a difference.
Yeah, it's the best intentions, but if they don't see the whole picture, then they're blind in one spot. And
correct. But we also, I'm being the devil's advocate. By the way, that's how we like to work in Grieg. We find it very uncomfortable if we agree. So we like to sort of see different perspectives. So I agree in a sense, but I also would say, well, look at our industry. Is our industry behaving? Are we following the rules? I believe there is this.
Well, do we even have a great culture in the industry in general? Is another question coming from the female side of the maritime industry. Right. I would say no, in general.
But I mean, so especially here, my closest network is in Norway, and I just see high quality shipping. So genuinely are going beyond in the ESG reporting and trying. Oh look, people that are passionate about making the industry better. But we have to understand that looking out in the big world, the IMO doesn't just deal with Norwegian ship owners, do they? So maybe we also have to have a bit of respect that they have other challenges on the table. And the reason I raise that, Jacqueline, is that I genuinely believe that collaboration is key. Sustainable development goal number 17, partnerships for the goals. But part of that is, and in critical thinking, is to try to understand the other party's perspective.
Yeah. But I didn't sail Norwegian flag. When I was working on ships, I was sailing Belgian flag, which was quite good, and I was sailing US flag, which I would actually say is quite bad,
Okay.
as far as culture on board and the way people handle situations with each other and treat each other, and also are necessarily following up on things in a good, productive way. And, I can imagine that it's quite a broad spectrum, even further on the side of not so good, depending on which country, nationality, and how those groups work together. Because it could also be, when I was working in Belgian flag, we had 14 nationalities on board at one time. For a crew of 32, it's quite a lot. But you could also see that, if you have only one nationality or you have many, many, many nationalities, that the culture is sometimes company dependent as well.
And maybe even ship dependent.
Maybe. But a lot of the time, you're not on the same ship all the time, so it depends, really.
So you've shown me a picture here,
Mm-hmm.
mapping the ocean industry landscape.
Yes, it's an attempt. So I had before attempted like this. So the first few people that I interviewed, we were talking about the ocean space this way a little bit. So with the kind of segments going from like hub and land, I think I have our faces on top of it. Yeah, it doesn't, I can't move us. So going from deep to coastal to inland, and then like hub and land. So you have like major mega ports versus small ports versus inland waterway ports. And talking about kind of the infrastructure assets and people. So what you could see in the industry versus what you couldn't necessarily see in the industry, which is kind of the professional services and the governance and regulators. Like, they're not physical assets, they're intellectual assets on the industry. And then I had kind of the owners and the segments, from producers, transporters, constructions, expedition, naval, and such like that. But then I was trying to figure out, because I got a lot of more input of things that I didn't think about, because I'm learning as we go on this one, how I might draw that out in my notebooks and figure out how I might possibly visualize this. Sorry, I'm not a great drawer.
I thought it was pretty good.
And then I kind of came up with this side of it because I went there. So I was trying to group things together. So I was like, oh, okay, invisible forces. We had all of these things that were brought up in conversation with many people. And I put like little Post-it notes for each one and then tried to group them together into areas. So things that are invisible forces on the industry. It's like regulatory forces, industry bodies, political, and reputation, because you have to do reputation management, whether you like it or not. And then services that are provided to the industry versus adjacent industry and sectors, and visible infrastructure, and then finance and insurance, which I completely forgot about in my first attempt at mapping this. And that kind of came into this more clean picture of grouping, but you can't see all of the detail. But I do hope that by the end of the project, I have really great detail here that I can put up, and
So
mapping all of the connections of how one thing influences the other, or how they're connected to one another and how they interact.
So, what is the value that you're trying to create by mapping the ocean industry landscape?
Well, I want one for what it is now, and I want one for what it could be. So the first part of it's a 9-part project, which is a little bit crazy to do in 100 days, but I wanted to apply human-centered design practices to the industry as a whole, because there's been some use of it applied to the business. So business design from a human-centered perspective. So what are all of these people in that position doing? And what are they relying on technology to do for them? And how is that task split between what they do and what systems they use and what value they provide to the outside world when they work together? And how can you maximize that kind of value? And then I want to apply it to the industry as a whole. How can the industry provide that maximum value in the best way, where we're creating new jobs and new roles, because the technology is evolving so quickly that the roles are going to change. The way people work is going to change. And how might we prepare for what that might look like in the future? So that's where I'm trying to go. I don't know if I'll be successful in it, but at least we can talk about it.
Sure. Well, I think you're very brave, and I think that's excellent because we need brave people, and it's quite a challenging task that you are giving yourself, with a purpose then to find out how we can do things differently, I guess, or create more value.
How we might make the world that we want to have, and not just the one that happens to us. Because right now there's a lot of forces going on, and there's a lot of ways that it could be solved, and there's ways that might be more beneficial for us all together, and might be a down trade for someone in that player, and how to look at it from kind of a ocean cluster perspective and not necessarily a one company perspective.
So I suppose what I experience, having worked both as a technology professional and as a commercial person selling technology in the maritime space, one of the things I experience is that we often start the conversation already in the maritime space, but what's missing here for me is our purpose, and for me, I believe the purpose of the vast majority, I assume, of maritime companies is to contribute value to society. Be that world trade, be that moving energy, be that moving people. So the most important thing of all really is everything around us.
Yeah, that's like when I had grouped the operations of assets here in this one, on one of the older ones, it was about production. That's what we're serving the world, or we're giving transportation, or we're giving construction of assets, or we're doing expeditions. So researching and surveys and explorations, and that's a service that we're providing the world, or naval, so security of ocean spaces and supply chains, or people and passengers. And that's how I grouped it, because I think that those are the services that we're actually providing through these different segments, because I see that people describe themselves in segments as tankers or containers, or we're in bulk, or we're in, but actually you're in transportation as a segment, because that's what you're selling. You're not selling necessarily bulk. Bulk is a kind of commodity that you happen to carry. It's, I don't know. I'm trying to make it make sense, but it's difficult to categorize.
So where are we now? So is it which slide is your latest?
So this is my latest one.
Okay. So here, I think you might want to consider academia as an invisible force, critical really. And one of the ways that this type of work can be used as well is to try and encourage people to want to join our industry, right? I wonder if you should consider the society on a more local level. So ports, for example, are critical. You have one in the top right-hand corner. So then you have the port, but you also have the people that live near the port.
Yeah.
Could be something to consider.
The good thing is that part 4 of this, because this is part 2, part 4 of this series is all about the people, all about the stakeholders, all about their roles, how they work, which should be very interesting. But I have to line up people to talk to, because every day it's like a small, okay, I have to make sure that I get people lined up. Sometimes I get them lined up like a week or 2 in advance, but it's always a challenge getting everything set up right.
Yes. So just so I understand, especially with your background, where is the crew here on this?
Yeah, the crew map comes afterwards because it's coming with the people.
Okay.
So this
fine.
is all about the industry shape.
Yeah, forgive me for asking. It's just that having worked 20 years in shipping,
Yeah.
the most critical thing we have are those brave souls out there in variable
Definitely.
conditions, day in, day out. And sometimes I feel there isn't enough focus on them.
I think about them every day because I make tools for them.
Yes, you do, don't you? That's your job, is to make the tools more user-friendly from a crew perspective, right?
That's exactly what my
Yeah,
job
I
is.
remember that now. Well, no, I'm still genuinely.
I have a lot of hats that aren't my job, but that's my
Oh, no,
job.
very good. But the reason that I just was reflecting over this was just how we let the crew down in COVID-19 as a society, this world society, that our purpose is to help.
Mm-hmm.
And they allowed my crew to not get medical care because they were afraid of letting them go on land. There will come a time where a proper wash-up will be done.
Yeah,
And
it
how the world
was
reacted.
absolutely horrendous how that all went down. And it's every single company, every single seafarer. It was a nightmare for them. Some of them were, the lucky ones were trapped on board and getting paid. The very unlucky ones were months and months and months, especially contract workers, where they couldn't get a job.
Yeah.
And when they're used to working every 3 months or every 2 months, and then they're forced to take a year and a half of unpaid leave, it can really destroy a family if they're a single earner.
Well, maybe I see that we've been going for almost an hour.
Yeah.
So maybe to land this then, from my perspective, thank you for inviting me. So if I was going to summarise, let's think of the crew, everybody. Yes, these big decarbonisation challenges and change are important, but let's never lose sight of the fact that those incredibly loyal, brave, talented people are out there doing this business for us. So
Definitely.
keep them in focus. You said human-centric, so be amazed how some forget that factor.
Yeah.
And I also hope that I try to give a balanced view of the journey, the exciting journey we're on of decarbonisation. And even though it's really difficult, let's not get into a polarisation situation. Let's work together. Let's listen to each other's perspectives and respect them, and encourage every bright woman and man that wants to join this industry to join the industry, because there is an incredible opportunity related to these decarbonisation and digitalisation
Definitely.
opportunities, that it must be a great place for